Before we get started, if you're finding the ideas in this podcast resonate with you, I would recommend reading the Restorative Faith book. Similar to the podcast, the book tackles many of the big issues that people often find problematic about the Christian faith. Not only does the book provide an in-depth review of the entire Christian faith, but when you purchase the book, you help to fund the Restorative Faith podcast. So if you like what you hear, support us by buying the Restorative Faith book on Amazon or visit us at restorativefaith.org. I do think that story is so powerful.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're willing to describe the situation that occurred. You have total editing rights over all of it.
Okay.
So what I'd actually like you to do, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Let's tell the whole story.
Yeah.
This is Liz, a member of my congregation. Liz has short brown hair, possesses an infectious laugh, and cares deeply for the people in her life. Although her personality is very unassuming, she never ceases to amaze me with her life experiences. So we sat down together, and I asked her to tell me the story of how she met Pete, her first husband.
I was 16. I was just about to turn 17 when I met him. And I was working at a restaurant in Woodfield, and he worked at a men's clothing store. I was attracted to his incredibly good looks. And I liked his kind of sweet demeanor. He just was a lot of fun, and he was funny, and we laughed a lot together. We got married. I was pregnant. Michael was born in October. We got married in May. And we had already started talking about marriage prior to finding out that I was pregnant. So for me, it felt like this was a committed relationship, yet I felt incredible shame. I mean, it goes against what I was taught in the church. I'm pregnant out of wedlock. And I was very ashamed of it. And the idea of not getting married was really scary because of all of the shame that I had. We dated for a little under 2 years before we got married. I was 18, 1979. It was fun. And then it was fun with some problems. And then it was problems with a little bit of fun. And then it was just nothing but problems. That's kind of how it progressed. And in the early years, I mean, we had a housewarming party after we moved to a new apartment. He started drinking, and it was drinking too much, and he was holding the baby, and he dropped the baby. Michael was like 4 months old at that time. It was scary, and then he would go out and not come back until, like 3 a.m, and I wouldn't know where he was, and he wouldn't tell me, or he would tell me, but I wouldn't really believe him. So, I think he was probably cheating early on. I just couldn't catch him at it, and I tried. His parents had moved to California. All of his sisters had moved to California, and they were all kind of going, come on, you have to come out here, it's so great. I mean, it was a lot of fun because his family was a lot of fun. He had a large family. There were 6 kids all together, and everybody had little babies, and my daughter was born, and we just really couldn't afford to make ends meet. California was more expensive, and now I had 2 little babies, and he found a friend that lived on this ranch that they were renting out. It was like this shack in Corona, California, in this horse country. They were renting for like $150 a month. So we moved in there. The whole family came and helped us clean it up and, make it suitable to live in. And on the property, there was this summer home that belonged to the owner of this ranch that was abandoned. And they had this old cement pond, and it was shaped like a bowl. It was designed to look like a reflective pool, so the overhang from the cement came out from the side of the pond. And it was empty the whole time when we moved in there, but then when the next spring came, everybody that lived on the property went and they cleaned it out and filled it up with water so that we could swim in it. The day that we were cleaning it out, it was all muddy in the bottom. We had to empty it out, clean it all out. Michael and the other 2 little kids that were living in the ranch were riding their big wheels, down the bowl and up the bowl. After that, Michael became really infatuated with the pond. And so we were constantly keeping an eye to make sure he wasn't getting out of our sight. So we went and we bought a car. We left the kids with family friends. I got in a car accident test driving a car, and the car got totaled. Somebody hit me. I had this neck injury from it, and we still wound up buying a car because my ex-husband was just determined we were going to get a car. So we picked another car and we bought that car. So we went straight home, and he gets on the phone, and I'm nursing my baby. Angie was nursing. I hadn't nursed her all day. So I was like, you watch Michael while I'm nursing the baby. And he was on the phone and just telling everybody about the car, and I'm like, where's Michael? Where's Michael? He's out there. He's out there. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, where's Michael? He's like, oh, he's out of my sight. I'm like, go look, So he goes looking, and a few minutes go by, and he doesn't come back. So then I go running down to the pool, which he hadn't looked at. I get there, and he's at the bottom of the pool. So I jump in, and I can't get out because of the way that the pool is configured. And I'm afraid that if he's going to live, I'm going to dash his head on the side of it and cause another injury. I can't get out of the pool, and I'm screaming, and then my husband finally came back. He was on his motorcycle because he was going down to the end of the driveway. He wanted to see if he left the property, and he came back, and he helped me out, turned Michael upside down. All this water and mud, and he was all white. And this kid came running down, and he started doing CPR. And we called an ambulance, and we waited a few minutes, and the ambulance didn't come. We didn't even hear the ambulance, and the hospital was not that far away. So they put him in this guy's truck that lived on the property, and this kid, Will, gave Michael CPR all the way to the hospital. It took them like an hour and a half to revive him, and then they put him in a phenobarbital-induced coma, and said that they didn't know if he would be brain damaged, and they wouldn't be able to know until they brought him out.
My name is Alex Lang, and you are listening to Restorative Faith, my podcast for those who question and doubt. The goal of this series is to recast Christianity in a new light. This season is about sexuality and its role in driving people away from the church. In our first episode, we explored the negative repercussions of purity culture and the belief by many Christians that sex is an act sanctified by God. In our second episode, we explored the moral connections between sex and reproduction by examining how the biblical approach to the abortion debate makes little sense in our modern context. In this episode, we're going to explore the connection between sex and marriage. As we discussed in episode 1 of this season, many Christians believe that God desires for humans to remain completely sexually pure until they are married. Only after their union has been blessed by God and the church is this newly married, heterosexual couple free to indulge their sexual appetite. But this newfound freedom does come with certain limitations. The expectation put forth by the church is that this couple will only have sex with each other and will remain married for the rest of their lives. The only way the bond of marriage can be dissolved is when one member of the marriage dies. Divorce is not an acceptable option and is only permitted under very extreme circumstances. This is how most Christians think about marriage. Two people bound together for the rest of their lives. The question we're going to explore in this episode is, does this model of marriage make sense? Humans have been on the earth for tens of thousands of years. Is this the way we've always been? Or did this model of monogamous marriage evolve over time? And most importantly, what happens to those of us who are unable to conform to this very strict and narrow definition of permissible human relationship? To explore this further, I want to return to our story about Liz and her son Michael.
So when he came out of it, there was all this abnormal movement, and he started to slowly recover some things, like he couldn't even move his eyes. He couldn't track anything with his eyes, and he started tracking things. He couldn't laugh anymore. His jaws were clamped shut, and I would have to do like range of motion on his jaw and care for his gums and all of that. And it was weird because it was not really me who was supposed to be watching him. It was my ex, but everybody was blaming me for the accident and, just saying things that I would never say to somebody that had just been through something like that. And I was just like, I need to be home by my family who will love me while I'm going through all of this, So we moved back to Chicago. And then after that, Michael could sit up and he could eat food. He was able to communicate verbally. It's very difficult to understand him. It's always been. We tried to share the responsibility as much as possible. Most of it fell to me. because he was working full time. And at that point, I tried to work and I couldn't concentrate at work. The marriage was just never really very good. It was like I kept having to slide over what I believed in to stay in the marriage. Allowing people to come in my house and smoke weed, and allowing him to drive while he was drunk with the kids in the car. Things that I'm really ashamed of. I put aside those things to not get him upset because he had an explosive temper. He just punched a lot of holes in the walls, so it was very threatening. And I was always afraid that he would take it out on the kids, so I had to really watch that too. I just felt like I was on high alert all the time. I think a lot of it was the church, this whole sin around divorce and around marriage out of wedlock. And there were a lot of people of my generation that wouldn't have done it. They weren't clinging to those old ideas, but I still was, and I think it's because I married so young and I didn't have time to really develop my own view with all of my faulty beliefs that I never questioned.
Given that Liz was staying in a highly dysfunctional and abusive marriage due to the beliefs she had been taught by the church, I asked Liz if she could recount for me her early memories of growing up in the church and when she first remembered hearing that divorce was considered to be sinful and wrong.
Alex, I come from a kind of crazy family, so my mom was a very neglectful mother. It was a very transient life that I led as a child. A lot of divorce, a lot of moving around, a lot of changing marital partners. And, my church experience was as transient as my home experience, and we moved 25 times in 18 years. We started out in the Catholic Church, and then my parents got divorced, and then they both stopped going to church because divorce was really frowned upon. My mom decided to bring me to catechism when I was 7. My mom said, I want to bring him up Catholic, even though she hated the Catholic Church. And my first day in catechism, the nun asked everybody to raise their hand if their parents were divorced. And 2 of us raised our hand, and then she pointed at us and she narrowed her eyes and she said, your parents are going straight to hell. And I was just like, oh my God. I just sat there like devastated, and I sat through the rest of catechism and I went home and told my mom. And my mom has the worst temper you've ever seen in your life. So she was just screaming and swearing and went to the church and told off the nun and took us out of catechism. Used some choice words, and that was the end of that.
Liz's story raises a really interesting question. Where did this nun get the idea that a married couple who divorces is going to hell? Well, to answer this question, we need to take a moment and look at the scriptures in the Bible that speak about marriage. Specifically, we need to examine what Jesus has to say about marriage in the New Testament. There is one scripture in particular that addresses this issue head-on. It comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 4 through 9, where Jesus is asked a question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any cause? Now, I'm paraphrasing here, but Jesus says that God made humans male and female, and once the two have been joined together, they should not be separated. In other words, once you're married for life. The only exception that Jesus makes is if a man's wife is unfaithful to him and commits adultery. So this nun who was screaming at Liz that her parents would go to hell was seemingly espousing Jesus' views on marriage. But if we dig a little deeper into the passage, it's a bit more complicated than this nun made it out to be. Jesus ends his remarks on marriage by saying, "Whoever divorces his wife, except for unchastity, and marries another woman, commits adultery." Now we have to remember that in ancient Palestine, only the man could initiate a divorce because his wife was his property. So Jesus' primary audience for this teaching is men. And he's telling these men that they should only be allowed to divorce if their wife commits adultery. The issue being addressed by Jesus that is often overlooked is that a man could divorce his wife for literally any reason he could think of. If she doesn't bear him a son, he can divorce her. If he doesn't like her cooking, he can divorce her. If he doesn't like the way she looks at him, he can divorce her. And as we talked about in the first episode, once a woman has lost her virginity, she also loses her value. So if you're a woman and your husband divorces you, then you are likely going to live a life of destitution. And although your ex-husband can remarry as many times as he likes, marriage is no longer a viable option for you. So when Jesus issues his teaching that men and women should never divorce, he said this to protect women because what he saw happening all around him was men treating women like objects and discarding them like trash. He was defending the rights of women because they had no legal recourse. Had Jesus known that his words would have been used by the church to hurt women and prevent them from leaving abusive and toxic marriages, I have the distinct feeling he would have modified his stance on divorce, which would have been very helpful for Liz because her commitment to marriage, which was grounded in beliefs taught to her by the church, caused her to stay in her marriage to Pete well beyond when she should have left.
He had become a more invested father. We were in our late 20s, and he was not going out and doing all of these things. He was starting to support things that I wanted to do, and I felt like our marriage had a chance. And so we started talking about having another baby, and I was like, look, you really fell apart. You're a great dad, but you're terrible with babies and toddlers. He was like, Liz, I was so young. I'm different now. You can see the difference. So we decided to have Jeanette. Angie was 10 and Michael was 12 when she was born. And then when Jeanette was a year old, I got pregnant with Charlie, and it was unplanned. And Pete had started the same old thing that he did with the other ones. Just the thing that I was afraid of that I knew was going to happen. We had this whole conversation, and he decided that he was going to leave until I learned my lesson. And that's when I knew I would never let him back in my life, because we have a handicapped son, and my daughter, Angie, had just made a suicide attempt. And she had been through inpatient, outpatient, and IOP, and she was still in IOP. And I'm like, all right, we've got this child that just tried to kill herself. We've got these 2 kids that are going into high school next year. We've got 2 little babies. And you're waiting for me to learn a lesson. Why don't we talk about what you want to do here? And you're going to abandon all of us to teach me a lesson? And he really abandoned everybody because he knew how hard it was. He wanted me to suffer. I've been putting up with all this crap. I should have been the one to leave first, Why didn't I do that? I was angry with myself. But I was devastated because I loved our family. And even though he was flawed in so many ways, I loved him. I did. And I think the thing that I didn't see is that he didn't know who I was deep down. He didn't invest himself in knowing that. I was only an object to him. And to be in a marriage with him, you just have to be okay with being an object.
But the devastation of the loss of Liz's marriage was not just limited to her immediate family. Liz also experienced this loss within her church family.
It was a big community. There were a lot of friends. The kids had friends there. And we went there right after I got separated. There were a lot of people there that I knew, and they were very friendly, and we had been close in community that were kind of pulling away a little bit. Like, they welcomed me in, but then they just kind of pulled back. I felt judged for going through a divorce. I always was helpful with my neighbors, and if I needed help, I could ask them for help. And I just felt like my community around me, my neighbors, stopped, like they just ignored me. Here I am, this mom with 2 little babies and a handicapped son and, a daughter that's been in the hospital. And my neighbor would plow his snow and he'd stop at my sidewalk and I'd be like, God, And I just felt like if I had been widowed, everybody would have been pitching in. But I'm divorced and nobody wants to have anything to do with me. It's almost like it was contagious. It's so crazy, but I really think I lost a lot of friends, really close friends. My 3 closest friends just basically stopped talking to me. I think that they thought that I was going to go after their husbands or something. Like, I don't even know. I was younger, and I was an attractive young woman. I mean, maybe they were intimidated. Maybe some of their husbands thought I was good looking. I don't know what that was all about. But I just felt like, wow, I would never betray my friends. I would always show up if anybody needed anything. Now I'm going through this and I'm abandoned.
This question that Liz poses is actually quite profound. Why did her entire community abandon her? As she said, had she been widowed, everyone would have stepped up to help her out. But because she was divorced, she now carried a stigma. From the perspective of her friends, Liz could not be trusted because she had broken the church's most important rule surrounding marriage. Once you marry for life. But that perspective is rather narrow, because Christian marriage only represents one of many types of human relationships. Indeed, if we look at other cultures across the world, we find there is an amazing variety of ways that humans create relationships with each other. For more on this, we spoke with Dr. William Jankowiak, professor of anthropology at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dr. Jankowiak is a world-renowned expert on human relationships and romance. So we asked him to walk us through the history of human relationships. And the place where he began was by describing what we know about the societies of hunter-gatherers, because they represent how humans have lived for most of our history on this planet.
The average hunter and gathering band's anywhere from 20 to 100 people, and they're always moving. And with that becomes a certain psychology, the psychology of being open, individualistic. Hunters and gatherers are constantly breaking up and shifting camps. There's no such thing as a clan. And you also, how do you raise kids in a hunters and gatherers? You don't yell at them. You let them do whatever they want. Now contrast that to agriculture. You beat the kid. The kid must obey. There's a time to plant, a time to sow. There's not a time to experiment. To experiment can lead to death. So there's a real emphasis on hierarchy, on obedience, and the individual must uphold the right of the family. Hunters and gatherers are completely different. There's no time to sow because there's nothing you're sowing. You're hunting, you're looking. Creativity, originality, if you will, going against the rules is very favorable. They practice share and share alike. If someone finds stuff, you share it with everyone else. Now, I don't want to go, Tim, to be totally altruistic because often you'll snack if you kill something, which makes sense. You don't have refrigeration. If it's killed out, if it's a big animal, you'll send word to the camp to come out to where you're at. Say if you kill a buffalo or a giraffe. Once you get there, you're able to protect your kill, and then you send word. And of course, everyone shows up because, again, there's no refrigeration. They do smoke the meat, but it makes sense to everyone to come share. And of course, if another group's out in another area and they kill something, they will tell you and you will share. So it's a mutual benefit of sharing. I shared today, but maybe tomorrow you'll share what you got. So you can see the overlapping of just pragmatic interests. The other part that's very fascinating in terms of religion, in hunters and gatherers, you don't really see a monolithic religion. Some believe in a God, some believe there's many gods, some believe there's no God. They all believe in a sense of spiritual forces. In anthropology lingo, it's called animism. You begin to see the rise of a universal God with agriculture.
Since Dr. Jankowiak painted a picture of modern hunter-gatherers as being very egalitarian in their social practices, where they help each other to survive, I wondered if that same egalitarianism translated into their romantic relationships and sexual interactions. Although he was quick to point out that each band of hunter-gatherers has their own cultural practices, he provided some examples of how sexuality functions among these bands.
I have a very good friend. We went to grad school together, Barry Hewlett, and he studied the Aka Pygmies in Central Africa. Pygmies particularly form monogamous bonds. Polygamous marriages are there, but it's probably, 3 to 4% of the people that have it. On the other hand, we do see something here on male sexuality where they call it a walkabout, where the man would say, I'm going for a walk. And everyone knows what he's doing for. He's going to look in terms of having a sexual tryst with some other woman in an area. And then the understanding he will come back. Sometimes he'll tell his wife, I want to find another wife, which means he's not going to divorce, and there is divorce, but he wants to bring someone else into the marriage. With the Kung Bushmen, which we talked about in South Africa, 25% of all the killings are over women. So you see a sexual jealousy of someone taking someone else's wife or someone else's girlfriend. And so that's really quite volatile at that level. So get the point. There's this incredible ethos and morality of sharing and helping one another to material objects. At the same time, in that same setting, there is this underlying sense of tension as people try to sexually dominate or control or move around male-female interaction. And women, by the way, are very active on this. This is not patriarchy here. Women are very active in seeking, allowing, agreeing to.
What Dr. Jankowiak kept emphasizing to me is that the hunter-gatherer mindset is driven by individualistic thinking. This is necessary because the lifestyle of hunting and foraging requires a person to constantly be on the move. The consequence of this mindset is that one's sense of duty to their family relationships is very loose, due to the fact that a person cannot afford to be tied down by those familial relationships. For example, an individual might stay with a particular band of people for a few years and then decide to shift to a new band of people. Because this is so different from how our society functions, I asked Dr. Jankowiak how raising children works among hunter-gatherer communities.
Because we as a culture have defined children as teenagers or children, but that's relatively recent. Romeo and Juliet were 14 and 15 years old. In hunters and gatherers in tribal societies, most women are married at 14 or 15. They're considered young women, not children. That's a relatively recent with us. If your emphasis is on reproduction, a woman only has 20 years of fertility. So why would you wait to 25, 27? And you've taken away almost half of the fertility era if the goal is to have children. And in hunters and gatherers, a lot of times the girl will just go live with a guy. And if she spends the night with him, then people think they're now a couple. And so it means then the man has obligations to her and to any offspring that comes out of that union. Remember, hunters and gatherers are individualistic culture, and they're raised right from the age of 1 to be that way. They have a relationship with their parents as being an emotional relationship. Morally, they can go their own way, which is very, very different than an agricultural society where the morality is shifted entirely in terms of parents. It's immoral to go against parents. Though some do, they're all shunned by the society or looked down upon. It's not like a cool thing to do. While hunters and gatherers would be, it's individual choice. And Barry Euler had to point this out to me. Women are attracted to marrying or hooking up with a man who has brothers in camp because brothers hang together. And when the woman knows he has a brother in camp, she realizes she's going to be protected. Hunters and gatherers are bit by snakes, get hit, die. Death is a very common phenomenon among hunters and gatherers.
Dr. Jankowiak explained that the hunter-gatherer approach to relationships is what is described as serial pair bonding, which is when two people enter into a relationship with each other for an undefined period of time. For a few, it may last for a lifetime, but for most, it does not. The relationship is not necessarily exclusive, but it will often last for a period of years and sometimes result in offspring. There is no expectation that these two people will remain together for the rest of their lives. Instead, once the relationship dissolves, it is expected that each person will eventually find another pair bond. Although we can't know for sure, many evolutionary anthropologists assume that this is the way humans operated for most of our time on this planet. Where everything changed was around 10,000 years ago, when humans developed agriculture, which created the concept of land ownership. As Dr. Jankowiak alluded to earlier, this shifted human society from being egalitarian to hierarchical. And it was during this time that the concept of marriage was introduced into human society. We wanted to dig deeper into the history of marriage from an anthropological perspective. So we spoke with Dr. Agustin Fuentes, professor of anthropology at Princeton University. Dr. Fuentes has spent his career exploring the lives of our evolutionary ancestors. And when we asked him about marriage, he was quick to delineate that marriage and human pair bonding are two very different things.
The pair bond is a special, strong emotional, physiological, and behavioral connection between two adults. And marriage are two separate things. Marriage is a legal or religious assertion of union, which may or may not involve a pair bond. There are multiple kinds of marriage around the world today. Some are monogamous, that is, two individuals and exclusive. Some are polygynous, that is one male and multiple females. Some are polyandrous, that is one female and multiple males. And there's even sort of group marriages where multiple individuals are married together simultaneously. All of those actually have legal, structural, social, and religious contexts in which they occur. Marriage is seen in the Abrahamic traditions. They are very, very recent. The references to unions that are found in the Bible, almost all of these, if you were at the time where they were happening, would not look to you like a contemporary marriage. It was an economic and particularly important relationship for property and inheritance. And in fact, in many of these cases, property assignation included both the female spouse, the wife, and the offspring as property of the husband.
Although most Christians assume that marriage portrayed in the Bible has always been monogamous, it's important to remember that within the Old Testament, polygamous marriages were permitted. King Solomon is a prime example of this. Whether or not you could be in a polygamous marriage was not dependent on your morals, but rather on your economic circumstances. As a male, could you afford to support multiple wives and the children they would rear for you? The truth was that most men could not afford it, so they were monogamous by circumstance, not by choice. But those who could afford to be in a polygamous or polyandrous marriage, where you can have sex with multiple partners, would absolutely do so. Indeed, polygamy and polyandry are forms of marriage that seem to resemble the pair bonding practices of our hunter-gatherer ancestors. So we asked Dr. Fuentes to explain the role of sex in creating pair bonds among our species.
Humans are primates, very social primates. One thing that is characteristic of the social primates is that sexual activity, that is, the interactions between two or more individuals involving sexual physiology, desire, passion, engagement, things like that, these behaviors are not tied to reproduction. In fact, the vast majority of sexual activity is non-reproductive. That is, it serves other purposes, primarily social bonding. Humans globally have ridiculously large amounts of sexual activity compared to almost all other organisms. And step back for a moment, because this is really important, that sexual activity here is being defined very broadly. It is the different kinds of behavioral, physiological, contact, emotional, relationship, connectivity, all of those kinds of things. It is not just copulation. And if you think of it that way, you recognize that there's a diverse array of physical and emotional stimulation, interaction, and relationships that have a strong reaction by their participants that don't involve genital contact, copulation, and the potential of fertilization. And even more importantly, what you see is recently in the last 3 to 5 centuries, both in sort of a broader religious context, particularly in the Abrahamic traditions, and in a legal context, a separation of this one small part of sexuality, which is associated with genital contact and reproduction, or reproductive possibility, and all other sexualities, where a very small window of it is sanctioned in a particular context, and the larger range of it is not sanctioned and considered to be morally bereft or problematic.
Dr. Fuentes really tried to drive this point home, that the Abrahamic faiths have completely changed the way we think about the purpose of sex. From an evolutionary perspective, sex and sexuality have been critical in promoting pro-social behaviors among humans for tens of thousands of years. Whereas from a biblical perspective, the entire purpose of sex is reproduction. When sex is only viewed through the lens of reproduction, it places humans in a problematic position. We have evolved biologically to use sex as a dynamic means of deepening our relationships with other people. But as we discussed in our last episode, according to the Bible, it is only morally permissible to engage in sexual behavior if our aim is reproduction. This moral dilemma has been further compounded by the fact that in Western societies over the last 200 to 300 years, there are a number of social and cultural expectations to which we must conform. First, sex is only permissible within the confines of marriage. Second, the only legal form of marriage, at least until recently, has been monogamous heterosexual marriage. And finally, add on top of that Jesus' expectation that marriages should last a lifetime, and you have a recipe for a lot of unhappy couples. Because as Dr. Fuentes argues, from an evolutionary perspective, lifelong monogamous pair bonding among humans is actually quite rare.
So what's really, really interesting from that perspective is there's this extreme version of monogamy where the assumption that there's one male and one female, who identifies male and female, who are then locked into one another and are 100% exclusive in their reproductive activities and in their emotional attachments. That is extremely rare. It does happen in humans, but that's rare. But once that becomes legally sanctioned and mandated by a theological dictum, then you see an issue. This is something that occurs in humans, but once it becomes socially mandated via legal and religious structures, what happens to all the other kinds of relationships that are also deeply rooted in human history? And so here's where you start to get the problems when you try to enforce and restrict the diverse range of relationships people have into one uniform thing that combines an economic relationship with a theological assertion about relationships and then makes that the only acceptable cultural norm.
So what happens if you diverge from this one acceptable cultural norm? We wanted to explore those other types of relationships that can form among humans that are often overlooked or judged as morally inappropriate by society. So we sat down with Doug and Lynn, a couple who have been married for 30 years, but their relationship is quite different from most married couples living in America today. Doug and Lynn have an open marriage, meaning they are married to each other, but each of them have relationships with other people. Lynn has a boyfriend, and Doug has a girlfriend. But their relationship has not always been this way. So I asked them to explain how their marriage evolved from being monogamous to being open. And it all began with the birth of their son.
I became pregnant with our son, and at about 4 months, my water broke. And I was on bed rest, and they told us that it would get to a point where I would probably have to be hospitalized for the last 3-4 months of the pregnancy just to be able to keep him where he needed to be able to survive. So I was home for probably only about 2 weeks after that happened, and then I had some issues. So I was in the hospital for over a month. And then he was actually born at 6 months old. He only lived for approximately 5 minutes and just had multiple different things. They had told us when my water broke and we had trouble that if he survived, he would have been nonverbal, have cerebral palsy, be in a wheelchair, and to be institutionalized to be able to survive. So we were preparing for that life to be able to make sure he was taken care of. Whatever disabilities he had, he was still our child.
This is where things start to get a little bit complicated. Near the end of Lynn's pregnancy, Doug began having an affair with a coworker.
The affair I had when I was 30, during the problems we had with our son, the affair only lasted a few weeks. When things blew up, she got caught. The husband is the one that came to us. He confronted me the day after I came back to work from burying my son. So it went about as bad as it could possibly go in a short period of time, as you can imagine.
I didn't find out about it at that moment. Doug did ask them to please not share that with me for a little bit till I was in a better state of mind dealing with everything that I was going through. I was recovering from a C-section, losing my son in that. We lost our son in July, and if I remember correctly, it was about September that I learned about it. And I will add into here too that she was actually one of my coworkers and friends at work as well. So we all knew each other too. He did move out. I needed to just put my head together. But when he was gone, it took less than a week before I said, you need to come home and we need to work through this because this is not something that I want to lose.
It was at this point that Doug and Lynn went to see a marriage counselor, who they both credit as being the person who would ultimately change the nature and trajectory of their relationship.
When we went through marriage counseling, we had a female counselor who convinced Lynn that just because I had physical relations with this woman It did not mean I loved her. And that was what I was trying to explain to Lynn. Like, I'm not in love with this woman. This was a physical thing, has nothing to do with love. And she couldn't understand that because she wasn't brought up that way. So it was actually the marriage counselor that convinced her that people can do that for the sake of fun and for the sake of doing it. I think that message stuck in both of us all these years later when we discussed opening the marriage. There was a period of a few years where I went through a process of rebuilding who I was because I felt I was the one that was causing 99% of the issues within the relationship. I was the selfish one. So I literally went through a reboot. In the process of that, Lynn had started to open her mind about things. As I was changing for her, she started changing for me and opening her mind to some of the things that I would say that before she would just not even want to hear. So once we started to communicate openly and honestly without fear of repercussion or fear of being told something we didn't want to hear, that opened up the conversation. Our first adventure into opening the marriage wasn't so much an open marriage situation. It was just inviting someone in to experiment and see what it would be like to have other people in a physical atmosphere, in a controlled atmosphere. We invited in my best friend, who I did not know at the time had already been with my wife.
Oh yeah, we should probably back up for a moment, because following the death of their son, Lynn also had an affair.
Months after our son was gone, I actually had an affair with my husband's best friend because he was actually one of the only people through all of that was a real big support with me. Not that my husband wasn't at all. He was my rock through that. It was just a different perspective. That got out of hand one time, so there was adultery involved with that relationship.
It's important to note that when Doug and Lynn made the decision to invite Doug's best friend into their relationship, Doug was unaware that this affair had taken place.
So he was more than willing to take part in what we were looking to experiment with. So that lasted over a year. Things just got weird. There was an uncomfortable feeling developing.
And he became very disrespectful.
Yeah, he changed in the process of it. So at that point we were like, okay, time out. We're going to step away from this. We ended that. Let's take some time to analyze what we felt, what we saw, how we thought, listen to each other's input. Okay, it was good at the start, then it got a little weird. Was there enough positive in it to try again to move forward?
From there, Lynn and Doug experimented with the swinger scene, but that didn't feel quite right because they realized that they weren't just looking for physical intimacy. They wanted something deeper than just random hookups.
We decided that what we truly were looking for, she was looking for all of the things that I give her. She was just looking for more of it. I was interested in the same thing she's giving me, just more of it. We live basically separate lives. I'm a truck driver. I'm only home 2 days a week. She's home by herself for 5. There are times when I am home and she's not. She might be on the other side of the world for work. So I might be home alone for weeks at a time. So all of that came into play in deciding to, let's see if we can find someone for each of us. She find a friend and I find a friend that we can trust, that is interested in the same type of relationship that we are, that knows their boundaries, and try that out. It didn't take but a few weeks, and Lynn found the guy that she's still with now. And it took me 4 different people of meeting and figuring out that nope, they were not the one, to find the woman that I have now as my girlfriend. Lots and lots of vetting and sifting through all sorts of people. We actually have friends in the lifestyle. 2 of the 3 marriages have dissolved because people got into situations with people that they never should have. And it soured and poisoned the actual marriage. We had all of that as examples before we made our final decision. So we had learned a lot from everybody that we knew that went through it, picked apart what we thought they did wrong, looked at what we thought they did right, incorporated that. It really came down to, and this is going to sound horrible, but a job interview. Thinking you find the right person online, talking to them letting them know these are the rules and the guidelines and what I'm looking for, what Lynn's looking for. And like having my wife basically interview my girlfriend and vice versa. Me meeting her prospective boyfriend, him seeing me and knowing who I am, that I'm the husband and I'm not going anywhere. And this is an extracurricular added bonus to her life that is not going to change our marriage.
As I listened to Doug and Lynn describe the process of finding the right people to participate in their open marriage, I began to wonder about the details. How do they make all of this work on a day-to-day basis? Are there rules in place that determine when they can and cannot spend time with their boyfriend or girlfriend? Is it emotionally challenging to see your husband or wife go off and spend time with another person knowing that they are intimately involved with one another? So they laid out for me the philosophy that undergirds their relationships.
We had set up a whole bunch of ground rules, and those ground rules actually caused problems in the end. There is one rule that will remain, that will never change, is our respect for each other. Our marriage always comes first, and the other person that we're involved with, they must respect the other person's spouse. If they don't, then that person is not the right person for us, because then they don't respect our marriage and us and what we're looking for. So that has been since day one, and that is our number one rule that will stay always.
My focus has to be on Lynn's happiness. Lynn's focus has to be on mine. If that is the dynamic, you can't fail. If you get an ounce of selfishness into this, you tend to try and over-control the situation and things start spiraling out of control. So you have to be as giving as a person could possibly be and be so wrapped up in seeing your spouse happy, no matter how that occurs, no matter what that person is doing in their life. If they're coming back to you with a smile on their face, happy, confident, and loving you for allowing them to live that life, you can't lose. So it starts with wanting happiness for the other person.
Communication is key. Along with that communication is honesty. You have to be able to talk to the other person, tell them, even if it's something that you know may hurt them, you just have to be able to dig in and go through anything. We've been together, as we've said, 34 years. Our communication now is so much better. We are able to talk and share and not afraid to say something to each other where we used to be guarded before. It's actually made our marriage stronger.
Our marriage now, I would put up against anybody's.
Absolutely.
Because we have learned between the communication of being able to never be afraid to say something and to understand that by allowing her to live her life as she sees fit and me to live my life as I see fit, we now appreciate each other so much more than we ever could have imagined.
What I find to be so interesting about Lynn and Doug is that their marital philosophy sounds very similar to the Christian ethics I preach about on Sunday mornings. The idea that we should be selfless, the idea that we should be fully invested in serving the needs of the people around us, the idea that communication and honesty are the keys to healthy and strong relationships. The true irony of the parallelisms between the Christian message and Lynn and Doug's relationship is that unlike many Christians, they are actually forced to live out these principles in real time because of the nature of their marriage. And yet, their marriage would be perceived by most Christians as morally perverse and spiritually bankrupt. Being that both Lynn and Doug have been part of the Christian faith, I asked them how they handle the stigma associated with open marriages.
I consider myself a Christian and I still read the Bible. And the Bible tells me I shouldn't be living my life this way, but it feels too right. It feels easy. It feels comfortable. It feels right for me. But I do it in such a way that I purposely don't want to hurt anybody. I don't want to mislead anybody. I'm not lying to anybody. I'm just living my life as I see fit.
And I'm living it honestly. So I feel that I'm living it honestly. I believe in God. I still pray to Him. Yes, I know the Bible is one man, one woman, but I don't believe some of the others in the church are the true Christians following it the right way. They're diverting with some of the things they do. I don't feel that it's wrong.
Yeah, there's no regrets And a lot of the other couples I know are being adulterous within their marriage and hiding it. And we've figured out how to do it on the up and up and make it better for our relationship. That's the thing. People just assume we're doing this for all the wrong reasons and it's all negative and there's no way it could build our marriage stronger. If you're doing it right, it couldn't be any farther from the truth.
The notion that opening your marriage to other people could make your relationship stronger is something that I think a lot of people would struggle to wrap their minds around. And yet, the reason why it works is because what Doug and Lynn are doing is arguably more natural to who we are as humans than trying to adhere to the standard of a lifelong monogamous marriage. Again, Dr. Fuentes and Dr. Jankowiak.
Tight pair bonding, sometimes involving sexually exclusive relationships, many times not, is characteristic of human evolution and human history. Strong relationships with one another. We could call those monogamous in the sense of they're mostly sexually associated with one another, but not necessarily. The problem is when most people hear the word monogamy, they think of the contemporary context of exclusive reproductive and sexual connection. And that's actually an extremely strict definition of monogamy. That strict definition doesn't have really deep roots. But the notion of strong individual pair bonds, that is two individuals having an incredibly tight emotional, physiological investment in one another and possibly having sex with one another exclusively, maybe not, but likely reproducing with one another, that is deep in human evolution.
I buy the Darwinian explanation of male-female sexuality, but my big thesis is I think men and women are very different in their approach to sexuality. But when it comes to love, they're the same. I think human beings are biologically polygamous, sexually polygamous, but emotionally monogamous. It's very difficult to actually truly love two people with the same intensity at the same time. Well, it explains why men really like polygamy, because they don't want to get rid of the wife who they really love, but they also don't want to cheat on the wife. So what a nice way of getting variety with the same time keeping everyone together. The contemporary polygamists are very, very interesting because the men compensate by having a favorite wife and the women compete among themselves as being. And if they become the favorite wife, they become the emotional wife. It's not economic. There's economic benefits, but that's not what's driving it. What's driving it is emotional exclusivity.
And here we come to the crux of the matter. Human beings are biologically polygamous. Both men and women have evolved biologically to desire to be with multiple partners over their lifetime. But at the same time, we are emotionally monogamous. We lack the emotional bandwidth to love two people with the same intensity at the same time. This is why Doug and Lynn have gone to such great lengths to identify who are the primary emotional partners and who are the secondary emotional partners. Doug and Lynn come first, their girlfriend and boyfriend come second. This creates an ecosystem where they can fulfill the biological desire for sexual variety, but at the same time, their secondary partners do not compromise the emotional connection they have with each other. This also explains why so many couples struggle with remaining married for the whole of their lifetimes. Our biological programming to seek out multiple pair bonds during our lifetime is coming into conflict with the modern religious and cultural expectation that we only have one exclusive pair bond for our entire lives. This conflict is particularly acute right now because the advent of modern medicine has extended the average human lifespan significantly. The average lifespan of an American in 1900 was 47.3 years. When you're dying in your 40s, the standard of being married to one person for your entire life feels doable because the odds are that one of you will die in the course of your marriage and the other one will have the opportunity to marry again. Today in 2020, the average lifespan of an American is 78.5 years. That's 31 more years of life, which is a lot longer to remain pair bonded with one person. For most people, our biology is not really designed to do that. Which brings me to the point of this episode. We are living in a very unique bubble in human history. For the last 200 to 300 years, We've all been part of a social experiment sponsored by the Christian church. Somewhere along the way, the church decided that every human should marry for life, and your spouse will be the only person with whom you can experience sexual and emotional companionship. Given that half of all marriages in the United States end in divorce, and according to a paper published by the sociologist Andrew Greeley, as many as 70% of all Americans engage in some kind of affair during their marital life, I think one could argue that this version of marriage, although it works for some people, is an ill fit with most human beings. We're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Instead, I think we need to recognize that human relationships have been and will always be very fluid. I don't think it makes much sense for the church to promote and prescribe a version of human relationship to which most people cannot conform. I believe we need to acknowledge that different people have different needs at different points in their lives when it comes to their partners. Rather than telling people what their relationships should look like, we need to meet people where they are. We need to ask, what are your circumstances? What is the state of your present relationship? Is it functional? Is it dysfunctional? Do you need counseling? Are you still in love? Do you need to part ways for the benefit of yourselves and your family? Or do you want to make it work? How do you want to make it work? And can we help you? Whatever the answers are to these questions, we as a church community need to be supportive, non-judgmental, and we need to let go of the idea that happily ever after always means until death do us part. I want to extend my sincere appreciation to Liz for laying bare the struggles of her relationship with her first husband. Liz has since remarried, and her second husband, Bob, has been the supportive, kind, and loving partner she always desired. I also want to thank Doug and Lynn for their bravery in sharing the journey of their relationship. Although their marriage might be open, they've kept it a secret from most everyone in their lives, including their adult children. It was a privilege that they were willing to tell their story publicly for the first time with us. Finally, I want to thank Dr. William Jankowiak and Dr. Agustin Fuentes. Both of these men are remarkable scholars in the field of anthropology, and we feel honored that both of them provided us with their insights into the anthropological roots of our ancestors. We will hear from them again in the final episode of this season. Restorative Faith is a collaboration between myself, Rebecca Anderson, and Laura Savage. The music in this episode was written by Iconics Music, DP Music, Eric McNerney, Maxim Pachenko, Roman Cano, Michael Musco, Brian Holmes, Toonlight, and Snow Music Studio. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit us at restorativefaith.org. So if you had the opportunity to sit down with your daughters and tell them about your open marriage, what would you say to them?
I would just say to them, I'm happy, everything is good. And it doesn't change who Dad and I are. We love each other more than ever before. We love you guys. It doesn't change anything. We're not going anywhere. We're the priority. Our marriage is stronger than ever. To my sister, I'm sorry this hurts you. I'm sorry you feel that I'm destroying the sanctity of marriage. But I'm not doing anything to hurt anybody else.
It's just added happiness, joy, excitement, and we're supportive of them and they're supportive of us. It's just all of the positive that you get in your normal relationship, you've just doubled it.
Next time on Restorative Faith.
When I kind of overdosed, the guy that I moved in with, he got AIDS. I slept with another guy, he got AIDS. I slept with another guy, he got AIDS. Everyone was getting AIDS. And I did not get AIDS. And I take that as a sign that God has spared me.
eventually got to the point where I couldn't keep it in anymore. So her family would invite me over for family dinners. It was very much like a supportive environment. Again, I was known to them as their daughter's best friend, but they really liked me. And I was naive enough to think maybe they'll be okay with me dating their daughter.
The way in which it can harm folks who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, in that kind of ethic, there's not even a place for them in our Christian tradition.